Zahájíme naše odpolední zasedání. Jako prvého poprosím pana Mihai-Dan Cirjana z Budapešti o přednesení příspěvku The External Limits of the Peasantist State, the Romanian Agrarian Movement and the Financial Crisis of an Eastern European State.
I would like to thank the organizer for the invitation and for the beautiful experience. Being hosted in one of the most beautiful bourgeois houses I ever visited and delivering a paper in what I heard is the symbolic center of the Prague bourgeoisie. I really feel that this is like a sort of a step up the social ladder, for me at least. Now some of the things that I will talk about in this presentation will sound very familiar, partly because they have also been touched upon by Antonia de la Jalova in her presentation yesterday, but also because things such as corruption, foreign financial experts, budget deficit, public debt, external loans will make it sound like a discussion about the 1990s in East and Central Europe or about the present crisis. Now, I will try at the same time to avoid faulty, dangerous parallel with the present, which might be a difficult challenge. Now, there has been an extensive discussion regarding the third way character of peasantist movements across East and Central Europe. Basically, namely the manner in which agrarians imagine the relationship between capitalism and economic development, and the alternative agrarianists offer to both state socialism and liberal capitalism. Scholars with an explicit interest in the Romanian Peasantist Party have also dwelled extensively on these issues. In what follows, I'll try to pick up some of these themes, but I will also try to recontextualize them. By this, I mean that on the one hand, I will refer to I will not try to analyze the political discourse of the Peasantist Party through intellectual history or through political history, but in what I call the performative character of the Peasantist political discourse, namely its capacity to reinterpret and mold the relationship between state institutions, economic processes, and local communities. And this is why I focused on something which might seem too common to be taken seriously or too banal to allow an analysis, and which we tend to take for granted as something inherently positive, namely the anti-corruption discourse, which the Peasantist Party used quite profusely throughout its career. At the same time, I will try to recontextualize this discussion by referring to the way in which the peasantist press saw the position of the Romanian capitalist state within the international financial system, and I will refer especially to the problem of the 1929 stabilization loan, which is like one of the most important economic measures ever taken in interwar Romania. Now, what did actually happen? I mean, what's the story that, to which I will refer throughout the presentation? Now, as like most countries involved in the First World War, Romania had renounced the gold standard in order to finance the war effort. Similarly, like most of these countries, the post-war period was quite a mess. It was a period of financial turbulences, instabilities, characterized by high inflation, unbalanced state budgets, and almost amazing, gigantic, outstanding, high public debt. The Romanian liberal governments of the 1920s tried to solve some of these issues in 1925, but the first attempts failed. In 1927, there were the negotiations for a foreign loan called the stabilization loan were started by the same Liberal Party. They were everywhere in the 1920s because basically throughout the whole period they were the ruling party. And they started these negotiations in 1927. Now, in Romania, as elsewhere, there was a general consensus regarding the necessity of returning to the gold standard. The stabilization loan was supposed to actually ensure this transition. Both the peasantist and the Liberal Party shared this consensus. The main bone of contention was how and with what means one should achieve this transition to the gold standard. Now, here you have a very, very schematic and somehow ridiculous description of what the gold exchange standard means. Ridiculous because it's something much more complicated. And I would just like to point out the role played by structural inequalities in the institutional design of the gold exchange standard. By this I mean that not all the countries participating or being pegged to gold had the same position. Agricultural countries such as Romania, Poland, Bulgaria, Hungary were in a considerable inferior position because they had to pay their public debt and consequently they had to resort to foreign currencies that belong to industrial countries. And as we know, most of Central and Eastern European countries did have an outstanding public debt. Now, the Liberals continued the negotiations throughout 1928, and by June, in what is for me one of the most enigmatic and strange events that ever happened, they announced that the final negotiations for the loan had been finished. Actually, they hadn't, and the Liberals had lied in the public press and in the Parliament, and they continued throughout the entire year. By November, the government collapsed, and 10 years of liberal domination had ended, with one of the most important reasons being their inability to obtain the much sought, the much needed foreign stabilization loan. Now, as one might presume, the discussion about this loan occasioned a big public debate, which is like a sort of a polite way of saying that it created a gigantic scandal in the Romanian public sphere. The Peasantist Party, which was the main opposition party at that time, saw in the Liberals' inability to obtain foreign financial support another instance of the Liberals' failure throughout their years in power. For the Peasantist Party, the support of the Western financial system acted as a sort of a test case for domestic polities, a test case for which one could actually assess and appreciate the soundness of the Romanian economic and administrative system. In their opinion, administrative mismanagement and the liberal corruption had shattered the trust of foreign financiers. With numerous examples of legal uncertainty, high level of corruption and state illegalities, international finance could not have had the courage to lend money for such murky financial backwaters as Romania was. Throughout the year, the Peasantist press denounced one corruption case after another: the oil file, the cooperative file, petty embezzlements, big bribes, petty bribes, illegalities, small or big, were continuously exposed in the main Peasantist newspaper, Dreptatea. In the Peasantist, these slides show they are from the main Peasantist newspaper, Dreptatea, and they're the sort of, they're not very funny. They try to be funny, but they're the sort of a caricature of the liberal prime minister trying to obtain the loan. As we might see, he's not very efficient in doing this. In the agrarianist perspective, international capital was seen as an impartial higher instance of truth. Since it did not participate in the local networks of corruption, it was seen as endowed with a form of ethical ascendance, because it was untouched by any biases in not participating in the corrupt, deceitful games of local politics. It was seen as a higher instance of moral value. Basically, it was just like and now I'm going to make a faulty parallel with the present, is like in today's obsession with foreign direct investments. Foreign capital is seen as a test case for the efficiency and legality of the country which is actually supposed to receive the foreign investments. The Peasantists have a similar opinion, despite the fact that Romania had actually had foreign investments in the previous years. And almost 76% of Romanian industry was actually controlled by foreign capital. And the Peasantist Party knew it, but as the main economist of the party put it, these were not serious investments. And this was not serious capital. It was a capital which had been attracted by the murky waters of liberal corruption. As we might see, the loan debate, the stabilization loan debate and the connection with international capital was also a discussion about local corruption. And throughout the entire period, the Peasantist Party somehow used the anti-corruption discourse. It was fraught with references to corruption. Most of these references were, of course, made in connection to their main political adversaries, the Romanian Liberal Party, seen as the fundamental expression of corrupt politics of a Balkan type. Symptomatic for this self-colonizing discourse was the racist derogatory terms through which liberal financial policies were described. One of the headlines of Dreptatea, the peasantist newspapers, analyzing liberal financial policies was financial gypsiness. Now, the Romanian term is țigănie, which is sort of a very strange term because it means at the same time a neighborhood where the Roma live, but at the same time shady gypsy activities. And it has a very sort of a strong racist connotation. Now, ironically, but not necessarily unexpectedly, the Liberal Party itself will try to appropriate the anti-corruption discourse once it found itself in the opposition. Now, in my paper, I see this anti-corruption problem, which was basically a sort of an obsession of the interwar period and of present times as well, as a certain form of popular epistemics. And by which I mean that this discourse actively participates and molds the way in which citizens in everyday activities or in the public sphere interpret and interact with state institutions. As it has been remarked by some of the sociologists and anthropologists working on current anti-corruption discourse, one of the reasons is that anti-corruption manages to set up the limits between what is considered to be the public good and what belongs to the sphere of private interests. This is one of the reasons why allegations of corruption are rarely made in connection to private capital. Most of the times they're made in connection to official and public authorities. And I could give you an example, but never mind. Another effect on the anti-corruption discourse is its individualizing effect. It's built on a peculiar sense of agency. Corruption accusations rely on the image of the culprit. The moral undertone which they convey presuppose an individual sense of agency, a person or an institution that can be accused and indicted. Structural explanations are not very anti-corruption. The anti-corruption discourse is not very fond of structural explanations, exactly because this sort of a moral evaluation of agency doesn't exist. Most of the, we know from Todorova and from reading the interwar press that it conveys also a sense of, it also has self-colonizing undertones. And this was also true not only for this period, but also from the Balkan states during the interwar. But at the same time, I mean, I don't want to make a sort of a demon out of anti-corruption, but because anti-corruption discourse is a popular way of criticizing an oftentimes unequal and iniquitous relationship between state institutions and the individual citizens. And it is because of this popularity that the anti-corruption discourse thrived in the interwar period, being adopted in the 1930s by what was to become the most devastating and dangerous critiques of liberal democracy, namely local fascism, in our case the Romanian Iron Guard, which also somehow continued the anti-corruption discourse, only that now they included the Peasantist Party in this cloak of corrupt political agents. For the Peasantist Party, consequently, for the Peasantist Party, the anti-corruption discourse was more than a set of random accusations of alarmist tone. It sprang from the way in which the agrarians understood the development of Romanian state institutions. Within this analysis, it did try to delineate and reshape what was public and what belonged to the public sphere. Thank you. Now, the peasantists somehow building about a complex mixture of Russian populism, the writing of the Romanian socialist Dobrojanu Ghera and Werner Sombart, developed a sort of a complex theory of what we might call now crony capitalism. Romanian industrial capitalism, they perceive it as being developed from this sort of an incestuous relationship between local industrial and finance capital and the state. This meant that the Liberal Party was the main representative of this oligarchy, which, by controlling state institutions, had managed to control economic life as well. Their anti-corruption discourse basically accused the privatization, what was also mentioned yesterday, the privatization of state institutions by local oligarchic networks, the undermining of the public character of the state through the private control of its institutions. In this sense, what they asked for through their program was a restructuring of the relationship between private and public, a redemocratization of state institutions seen as kidnapped by private liberal interests. Basically, we can see this demarcation between private and public very clearly in this caricature. And indeed, to a certain extent, the peasant discourse was incredibly efficient in trying to democratize these space and state institutions. Its inefficiency lay, however, in this is one of the instances of the peasantist obsessions with legality and anti-corruption. Santa Claus brings a lot of things such as honesty, legality, order, labor, and free elections. So in this sense, the peasantists were indeed very efficient. And indeed, their sort of a moral undertones were legitimized. But the anti-corruption discourse had also a sort of a dark side, let us say its inefficient side, which sprang from the primitive sense of agency that it relied on. This was very obvious when this analysis of local development of state institutions, which somehow prefigured crony capitalism, was contextualized within the international framework of the financial system. The anti-corruption discourse of the peasantist party managed to produce a very simplistic, dualistic interpretation which bore the mark of a self-colonizing discourse. Local financial and industrial capital was always put into contrast with the neutrality and unbiased nature of international capital. The corrupt relationship between local capital and the state was always contrasted with the unbiased nature of international companies and of Western finance. This created for their own economic program actually a lot of problems. They relied very much on this idea that international capital was unbiased. It was serious capital, as Majaro called it. Now, the problems appeared when they actually faced structural problems of the international system. Now, in February 1929, the peasantists actually managed to sign the last papers regarding the stabilization loan. They expected, after this, sort of a wave of foreign capital that might help Romanian economy. This didn't happen. It didn't happen not because international finance capital was bad, but because the Federal Reserve had raised the interest rate. This meant that American banks and the American financial system could not help the European financial system. This meant that there was no capital, basically. Again, structural determination undermined the peasantist moral discourse on capitalism. One of their expectations was also that due to their reforms and the transparency and the anti-corruption campaigns that they had started, it would be very easy to obtain foreign loans on the international markets. This was not true. And in the 1930s, the inequalities of the gold exchange standard made themselves felt. The Romanian state, when the Central European banking crisis of 1931 gave a very, very, very difficult blow to the Romanian financial system, the peasantists couldn't resort to any other means than basically get off the gold standard. And they introduced what currency exchange control. Capital circulation was now controlled by the state through its monopoly on foreign currency transactions. Serious or non-serious capital had to be controlled as it jeopardized the stability of the country. It seemed that the structural determination that the capitalist system could make actually foreign capital just as whimsical, as quirky as the non-serious local capital of a gypsy Balkan type. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cirjan. Jako další vystoupí paní Suzana Leček ze Záhřebu s příspěvkem To Use All Opportunities, Alternative Political Strategies of the Croatian Peasant Party, 1918-1941. Please.
Thank you, and thank you for invitation to this conference, which was really very interesting up to now, and certainly will be till the end. I won't speak about maybe so classical political history. I'm not sure how much do you know, but for the beginning, I will just give some very general political frame to understand better the position and why Croatian Peasant Party had such a peculiar development and why did it develop those mostly alternatives forms of political struggle. Namely, Croatia in the interwar period was in multinational state. You all know that it was generally known as Kingdom of Yugoslavia, though it changed the name twice. We can say that the state was, the political life in the state was characterized by the struggle between those who were for the centralization and unitary state and the others who fought for federalization of the state. And Croats were the ones who demanded federalization. Again, the second distinguished feature of the state was state repression. It was quite typical to use even physical violence during elections. So in those circumstances, it was sometimes impossible to develop normal political life. Croatian Republican Peasant Party, it was called Republican only for a short period of time in the early 20s. After that, they skipped that Republican from the title, from the name. Was a party who grew up very quickly. It was in only maybe 2 or 3 years, it turned out to be the strongest party in Croatia. During the 30s, it was the strongest oppositional party in the whole Yugoslavia. In Croatia, it became a more national movement than only the party. So it had support from maybe 90 or in some area even more than 90% of voters. And that is actually not normal to one party to have 90% of voters. But it was due to that specific political circumstances. One of them was resistance to decentralization politics, and the other was a very good program of the party, both national, because they offered that national platform, and the other, even more maybe important at that time, was that very good and elaborated social component. and economical component. I wanted to stress here that Croatian Peasant Party was most of that interwar period opposition party. That means that that party couldn't use the institutional ways to achieve their goals. So it was forced to find out alternative, we can call it also non-violent, forms of political struggles. I took that term non-violent from the literature in which this typology of non-violent struggle was very well elaborated, especially from Jean Sharp, who had differentiates almost 200 types of non-violent struggle. So, just in few words, the legal frame of that political struggle or alternative political struggle, first kind of periodization of political system. In first decade in Yugoslavia there was what we can call pseudo-parliamentarism, because there was parliament, but it's with very strong position of the king, and parliament was rather weak. We had 5 parliamentary elections during that period of time, and the worst thing were unstable governments. We had 24 governments only in 1 decade. After that, there was dictatorship, period of 6 years of dictatorship, and after that, parliamentarism was re-established, but we can call it maybe for this purpose now tolerated, because the political parties were not legalized. It was quite a funny position of political parties. They were not legal, but they were tolerated. So Croatian Peasant Party was forced actually to invent the other forms of political activity. First, they were in opposition, and second, they were and tried to be active in the times when political activity was completely blocked or partially blocked. I will here, they really introduced a lot of different forms, and I will here talk only about maybe 4 the most typical ones. First of that is boycott of cooperation with the state or state institutions. Second is developing of network of different organizations in different life areas. Then the third one is using of culture as a means of political struggle, especially during dictatorship. And the last one, symbolic resistance through party celebrations, or what we may call public manifestations. So the first one is a boycott, because it's a very powerful tool of resistance, because every power needs consent, voluntary or not. Boycott was implemented for the first time during the 20s by President Stjepan Radić. You can see him in the picture, who was he studied in Prague and finished and got his degree in Paris, so he was our first doctor of political sciences somehow. He was a great fan of British democracy, and he introduced for the first time in really in political language the notion of pacifism. So it was not wonder that in the political, in the party newspapers, there were a lot of articles, not read by him, but other people writing the articles about Tolstoy, even Gandhi. Not very often, but he was mentioned. They used the boycott on different levels and in different occasions, but here I will talk only about the boycott on the topmost level, boycott of the parliament, or as it was called, National Assembly in Yugoslavia. They boycotted the parliament during the 20s because they didn't agree with the general policy and general way in which the country was founded. It meant that the country was proclaimed to be monarchy before the Constituent Assembly even met. And after that, during the 30s, they again refused to go to the parliament, but this time it was because of the election law. And that law was made during the dictatorship and actually guaranteed the governmental party to win elections, and after that to have more than 80% of seats in parliament. So they simply said that there is no way to go there because they would just make it the assembly, which they considered to be illegitimate, they would give him legitimacy. Because they were not in parliament, they were most of the time non-parliamentary opposition, they were forced to use non-institutional methods to achieve their goals. Just a brief scheme about those periods of boycott. As you can see on the left side, those periods of state system I was talking about, and here you can see the years or months which Croatian Peasant Party boycotted going to parliament. So altogether it was in the parliament only for 3 years during the 20s. The second point I wanted to stress, and I think maybe this is the most, probably the most interesting and most important one, is that great effort to establish alternative social institution, as we can call it, alternative organizations. In some way, they really were able to replace some state functions. Those organizations, as you can see, actually they are not passive like the boycott was. Boycott was something when you restrained from activity, and this was active doing of something. Those all organizations were self-sustained. It meant that they didn't have any help, especially not financial help from the state. And today we are talking about them like a state within the state, because they covered different area of life. And they were, as you can see on the pictures, really mass organizations. Just to go briefly across them, most important probably was so-called gospodarska sloga in Croatian, or economic unity, but my colleague will speak more about it. Then peasant unity, it was cultural and educational organization, something similar that we have heard from the colleague from peasant and linemen in Slovakia. Just before the war, that organization had over 50,000 peasant members. It was exclusively peasant organization. Then women's organization, founded some of them already during the 20s. Croatian Workers' Union, it's a special union. Workers' Union, founded also already in the 20s. And Croatian Peasant and Civil Protection. Most controversial because it was a kind of semi-military organization, and it was banned immediately after it was founded, but continued with work semi-illegally. But as you can see, in 1938, when it was still illegal, had already 30,000 members. All of them, those organizations which were founded in the 20s, like Peasant Unity, Women's Organization, and Croatian Workers' Union, they ceased with activities during the dictatorship, though they were cultural or educational or whatever, but because they were connected with the CPP, they had to stop with all activities. But all of them were renewed in the 30s, to be more precise, in 1935. And the third point is culture as a means of political struggle. Culture, of course, had its role in national ideology, but here I would just like to stress its role during dictatorship, because all political activities were banned, so everything actually transferred, shifted to the cultural area. The tricky problem was that all intellectuals, who are usually had the main role in the culture, were employees of the state. And the state was quite clear in this respect, that they demanded complete loyalty of its employees. So what they were able to do is, from the one side, again, this passive resistance. They tried to boycott some events, or try to use that, what we can call scientific silence, when they were asked to support the new ideology, official ideology of that dictatorship time, and it was Yugoslavism. On the other hand, they really make a great effort to create in national style. It was not something new. National style started in 19th century, but it was maybe the 30s were golden age of it, starting also with the time of dictatorship. And of course, on the lower level, in popular culture, we can see that kind of resistance in wearing national costumes, these folk costumes. Actually, this is not the peasant picture, but some middle-class party in the city. On the right side, you can see, probably you would never guess, it is the Christmas card, but with strong national symbols, not from the time of the dictatorship, of course, but 1935. With the national flag, a picture of Vlatko Maček, new president of CPP, and chains as a symbol of the state. And as the last point, symbolic public acts. I will talk only about party celebrations. There were few of them, but the most important ones were celebration of the birthday of President Maček. Again, the same principle, huge effort to boycott the state holidays. So they didn't go to celebrations of King's birthday or Unification Day in December, and they celebrated really on the mass scale Maček's birthday. These are the pictures, of celebrations in Zagreb, the capital. There was always the parade, which for hours go through Zagreb with maybe 10,000 people in the organized movement going through the center and passing below the windows of his attorney office. He was attorney. And just to conclude, Croatian Peasant Party, what I think it's very important to stress, was mass party, but it go further than having that mass support at the elections. They do that effort to organize people, and to organize the people not only in the politics, but in other areas of life. And they help people to feel that self-conscious, actually, that they are able to, what we now call, to make a difference in the world. They gave them the program, methods of fight, and organizations. So if we defined democracy as something more than going to the elections, if we think that it's actually that feeling that you can do something for yourself, in spite of everything, those few years in the late 30s were probably the years when the Croatian people came closer to democracy than ever in its history. So thank you for your attention.
Já děkuji, paní Leček. Já, než dám slovo panu Ivici Šutemu, rovněž ze Záhřebu, tak pro české a slovenské posluchače, aby ty referáty byly srozumitelné, bych rád řekl k tomu několik slov. Chorvatská selská strana, nebo původně Chorvatská republikánská selská strana, mnohem blíže než k naší republikánské, to jest agrární straně, má k Hlinkově slovenské straně ludové, protože to bylo masové hnutí s cílem vybojovat, respektive vrátit Chorvatskou autonomii, které Chorvatsko mělo vždycky, i v rámci Uher, v Jugoslávii ne. Čili pod tímto zorným úhlem bychom ty akce měli posuzovat. Rozdíl je v tom, že v chorvatské selské straně nehráli rozhodující úlohu katoličtí kněží, vysoké duchovenstvo, to je jedna věc. Za druhé, že působila v nedemokratických podmínkách, byla dokonce zakázána. A za třetí, když v roce 1939 vybojovala tedy autonomii v podobě chorvatské banoviny, tak potom 1941 po rozbití Jugoslávie se distancovala od německé okupace. Neudělala to, co slovenští ludáci, že tedy by se postavili do čela samostatného státu. Zachovali rezervovaný postoj, Maček byl dokonce internován na čas, což jim umožnilo potom i po válce o pokus, který už komunisté likvidovali, o pokus vrátit se do politického života. Působili dokonce jedna frakce chorvatské selské strany v exilové jugoslávské vládě v Londýně. Tolik jenom na vysvětlenou, protože si myslím, že pak ty referáty budou pro domácí publikum srozumitelnější. So, please, floor is yours.
Dziękuję, Dr. Rychlík. First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for the invitation. Special thanks go to our colleague Martin Kleczacki. It's a great honor to be here in Prague, and I would like to thank also our translators for doing their excellent and helpful job. So I will tell you something about economic leaders of Croatian peasant movement in the interwar period. It is impossible to understand the Croatian peasant movement between the two world wars without its three essential components: political, educational, and economic. A major role in the acceptance of economic components within the peasant movement in Croatia had, along with his brother Antun, a leading ideologist, founder and leader of the Croatian Peasant Party, Stjepan Radić. He thought that only the economic organization and education of Croatian people and democratic changes can achieve a lot more than a revolution and violent methods. In the realization of his ideas in practice, Radić relied on a number of good and dedicated employees who have faithfully stood by the party's program, founded in 1904. Among the comrades, certainly in the first place, the names of Josip Predavec, Pavao Radić, and Đuro Basariček should be mentioned. What connects all three of them, except for their comprehensive involvement in the party program, is the fact that they were killed during the dictatorship of King Alexander. One of the most important figures in the Croatian peasant movement in the 20s was an agricultural engineer, Josip Predavec. He was an economic ideologist of the Croatian Peasant Party in the first decade of the new Yugoslav state, founded in early December of 1918. Who was actually Josip Predavec? He was born in 1884 in a small village on the river Sava called Rugvica, where his parents had a small estate. After completing primary school in his native village, Predavec successfully attended a gymnasium in Zagreb. On the recommendation of the Radić brothers, young Predavec enrolled at the Economic Academy in Tabor, in today's Czech Republic. He finished his study in 1905 as a full-time student and the only Croatian on that academy. Young Predavec adopted all the rules of that school, and the Czech economy became his model for a similar development of the Croatian countryside economy. After completing his studies, Predovec traveled through Crane, Styria, Bohemia and Moravia. After returning to Croatia, he was working in cooperatives. He also worked in the newspaper of Radic Peasants' Party, Dom. In that newspaper, he published a series of economic articles with practical advices for local Croatian farmers. He also held economic classes in the villages between the Sava and Drava rivers in the northern Croatia, where Croatian Peasant Party had a great support from local peasants. In 1909, he went to Prague to visit local trade fair, which left a strong impression on him. He wrote in one article that the Czech exhibition, with the participation of landowners and industrialists, should be the model of the future similar exhibition in the Croatian capital Zagreb. In this way, he encouraged the establishment of the Zagreb Fair, today Zagrebački Velesajam, which began operating in 1909. Predovec traveled with some of his Czech colleagues from Prague to Denmark, where he had stayed for 2 months. In Denmark, he became impressed with the achievements of the Danish agriculture and organization of its economy. He gave a special attention to the milk production and organization of Danish exports of eggs to England. Because he was impressed with the Danish economic success, he called the people of Denmark, quotation, the happiest people in Europe. The political work of Josip Predovec cannot be separated from his economic engagement, which is stated in his political and election pamphlets, where he proved the necessary connection between political and economic components in solving the Croatian question. Before the First World War, Predovec became one of the main initiators of the establishment of the Economic and Educational Cooperatives DOM in 1913, which is supposed to be strongly influenced and controlled by the Peasant Party. The main task should have been the economic enlightenment, downloading farmer debts, receiving saving cartridges, and the support of the rural economy. However, the realization of these objectives have been disabled by the First World War. After the end of war, he was comprehensively engaged in the Croatian peasant movement, where he soon became vice president of Croatian Peasant Party. During the frequently imprisonment of the party's leader, Stjepan Radić, Predovec was engaged in conduction of the party, and he was also helping Radić's family. Predovec was engaged in expansion of the party in Dalmatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina as well, and thanks to his frequent travels to the provinces, the party achieved excellent results in the parliamentary elections in the 1920s. At the same time, he was elected on the parliamentary elections in 1925 and in 1927 as a national representative in the county Dugo Selo, where he lived and worked intensively as an economic expert. So what was Predovec's economic engagement in the peasant movement in Croatia? The main focus of his work was cooperative. He believed that it was the best form of creating strong economic organizations through which small farms in Croatia could successfully operate. From 1921 to 1929, several economic establishments were founded for the needs of the Radic's party and its membership. The most prominent were Croatian Peasant Hall at Zrinjevac in Zagreb, the headquarters of the party, or heart and soul of the Croatian Peasant Party. Then, the main society of the Alliance of the Croatian Peasant Societies, which was helping Croatian peasants in modernization of their farms. After that, the Insurance Society Providence, or Providnost in Croatian, which dealt with farms insurance against accidents and adverse weather conditions. And finally, the Croatian Peasant Cooperative Bank, or Selo Banka, village bank, which gave loans to affordable rural entrepreneurs and had central importance in the work of the party's economic action. Josip Predovec was one of the leading men of these establishments, and after Stjepan and Pavle Radic's death in 1928, he became the principal of those establishments. Thinking that the greater economic independence of Croatia could be achieved by strengthening Croatian peasants' economic base, thus also resisting the Serbian exploitation of Croatia, Predovec made every effort to preserve those institutions. Since all state financial institutions in Belgrade, especially privileged national and state mortgage bank, bared financing of the economic establishments connected with the strongest oppositional party in Croatia, Predovec had to resort to somewhat unusual, even though not illegal methods of financing. Necessary capital came only by the first Croatian saving bank in Zagreb, which at the time was the most powerful financial institution in the area of the Yugoslav state. However, it was not enough, and all these institutions had fallen into crisis in 1928. It was especially apparent from the mid-20s when the agrarian crisis struck the region. Just a few days before he was arrested, Predovec announced the new establishment of a separate institute for research and organization of peasant holdings under the name Gospodar, or Lord. This organization was modeled along the lines of similar organization in Switzerland and in Czechoslovakia. Actually, it was a precursor to what will organize and lead a young successor of Predovec, Rudolf Bičanić, in the second half of 1930s. The role of the Gospodar was to assist farmers to create a successful economy with the use of accounting and professional literature, statistics, etc. But the Belgrade government could not ruin peasants' party establishments until the dictatorship of King Alexander in 1929, when all those establishments fell down. Predovec was accused and sentenced for corporate misconduct. In that time, all political parties in the county, including the Croatian Peasant Party, were banned. Many Croatian politicians were caught and imprisoned, some were killed, and some have gone into exile. Although this was a rigged trial, Predovec was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison and 3 years loss of civil rights. At the same time, the regime's press started with defamation of his personality because he's been portrayed as an economic criminal who has robbed his own people. After his release from prison, Predovec started again with the political and public activities. He prepared for publishing a comprehensive study, The Village and the Peasants, as a synthetic overview of the history of the village and the peasants with a very strong ethnographic orientation. So you can see some pictures from that book. Because of all these activities, the government in Belgrade organized his murder in 1933. He was killed at his own farm in Dugo Selo by a local farmer. In conclusion, we can say that Josip Predovec had done enough to improve economic and educational life of Croatian peasants. He had made every effort to preserve all economic institutions of Croatian Peasant Party in the 20s. Under the changed political and social circumstances in the 30s, his work would be continued by his successor, Rudolf Bičanić. The most important person in economic organization of Croatian Peasant Party was Croatian economist and a rural sociologist Rudolf Bičanić. Bičanić belongs to the younger generation of Croatian economists who worked in the Croatian Peasant Party. He was born in Bjelovar in 1907 and educated in Zagreb and Paris. After returning to Croatia, he mainly dealt with social problems in Yugoslavia, not with Croatian political question, which was dominant in that time in Yugoslavia. After one return from Prague in 1931, Bičanić was arrested on charges that he wanted to enter into the country the anti-state materials. He was charged in a 3-year sentence and sent to the notorious prison in Sremska Mitrovica. In this prison, he was sharing a cell with also detained leader of Croatian Peasant Party, Vlatko Maček. It was crucial for its future activities. Thanks to the influence held by Maček and anger due to his imprisonment, young Bičanić became an outspoken member of Croatian Peasant Party. After being released from prison in 1935, Bičanić started his walking tour through various parts of Yugoslavia where the Croats lived. 1 year later, he published a very famous book, especially in Croatia, How People Live, about his impressions on the tour. The book presented shocking reports of serious existential living conditions of peasants in the Croatian countryside. He wrote, for example, a quotation, "Houses of farmers are miserable. They usually sleep on the floor in the same room with the cattle. Peasants living on the brink of starvation. They are forced to sell livestock to survive. It bothers them water problem, etc., etc." So, in 1930s, Bičanić started exploring the real state of peasants' life, and he realized the necessity of depending on their own spontaneous energy. In fact, the Croatian peasants had already begun to demand regional economic rights and other political concessions from the centralist Yugoslav government in Belgrade. Bičanić finally established in 1936 an economic organization of Croatian Peasant Party after the name Economic Union or Economic Concord, Gospodarska sloga. It was created on the basis of economic organization that was still in the 20s led by Josip Predavec. One of many characteristics of this economic concord was its democratic organization. It was organized not only for the peasant, but also by the peasant. This strengthened the role of the peasants, but it did not necessarily mean the exclusion of the workers. So Bičanić was inspired by the spirit of populism, and in a short time economic concord developed into a strong organization whose strength, because of lack of capital during the Depression, was in peasants' solidarity. That's why its motto was, "Through concord to freedom." In the beginning, the economic concord mediated between fertile Slavonia, in northern east part of Croatia, and the Dalmatian hinterland at the south, where Bičanić himself saw people go hungry because of drought. Gradually, Bičanić spread the activity of economic concord into practically every aspect of economic life of Croatian peasants, as producers and sellers, as consumers, and also as workers when they are working for wages in agriculture or forestry. To mention just a few of these activities: livestock breeding and inoculations against disease, establishment of dairy cooperatives, improvement in quality and better marketing of wool, better marketing of poultry and eggs, honey, wine and saltwater fish, etc., etc. Economic concord also bought considerable quantities of grain in surplus areas and sold it in food deficit areas in southern part of Croatia, Lika, Dalmatinska Zagora, Herzegovina. With the financial and moral support of Croats who lived in the United States of America and Canada, the economic concord also took part in the resettlement of children from passive areas to more prosperous regions in northern Croatia. Through special committees, the economic concord also tried to increase the interest of the peasants in health education and was sponsoring the project of electrification through rural areas. All of these activities were conceived and directed by Rudolf Bičanić. Thanks to its success, its membership rose from 6,000 at the beginnings to more than 227,000 before the start of the Second World War. It was organized at that time in more than 4,000 local committees and covered more than 5,000 villages. The membership represented at that time 1/3 of all peasant householders in pre-war Croatia. So, we can really speak about organized peasantry under the strong control of political party, Croatian Peasant Party, and its leader, Dr. Vlatko Maček. Thus, establishing connections with a political movement, the economic concord managed to organize local self-government after the local elections in 1936 and 1940. This, Bičanić thought, could be the basis of a peasant state. Therefore, in 1940, he gave his outline of a peasant state in his lectures. First of all, he insists that the peasant state must be the complex state. According to him, the peasant is the representative holder of the rural way of life and culture. Everyone could be regarded as a peasant as long as he keeps connection with his rural culture. Therefore, a worker or even a teacher could be called a peasant when he or she connects himself with rural life. By the word "the people," Bičanić means all inhabitants who support the rural culture. In that sense, economic concord is getting hold of total Croatian economic life by organizing the whole line of communities. Community of administration districts, the association of cooperatives of economic concord, etc., etc. When we detailized this concept of peasant state, Croatian peasant movement was at the top of its power. Soon after his ideas were published, the Second World War has started. Generally speaking, the economic organization of Croatian Peasant Party were quite successful in its operation. This success has to be ascribed to the feasibility of cooperative actions in most of its undertakings and to satisfactory leadership of Josip Predavec and Rudolf Bičanić. and to emphasize the fact that it was the creation and instrument of a political party at a time when this party enjoyed tremendous popularity and was the undisputed party political authority among the Croats generally and among the Croatian peasants in particular. Dziękuję za vašu pozornost.
Tak dámy a pánové, protože pan Sorin Radu ze Sibině se nedostavil a jeden referát nám tedy odpadl, tak máme více času na diskusi, kterou tímto otevírám předneseným 3 referátům. Prosím. Tak to bylo mimo program toto, to nebylo v plánu. Než se rozmyslíte, já bych tedy měl, I would have the question to all 3 panelists. First of all, I must admit that I don't know much about Romania. I know certainly much more about Croatia and Croatian peasant movement. But I would have one question. To what level can we find really a peasant agrarian, classic agrarian program in the Tzarist party in Romania and especially in the Croatian peasant party? I mean, like can we find it in Czechoslovak Republican Party? It means, for instance, customs protection of the peasants. It meaning a high protection against import of agricultural products. The plan for introducing of the so-called mortgage on the debts. It means that when there was an execution against the farmer, he could ask to postpone the payment for a certain time. And of course, the agricultural reform. I know that both in interwar Yugoslavia and in Romania, agricultural reforms, limited reforms, were carried out. But the question is to what level was this the part of the program of the Tzaranists and of Croatian Peasant Party? So you can start.
Now, I mean, to a certain extent, especially until 1935, when there was a certain change in the Romanian Peasantist Party, they were a sort of a classical agrarian party. I mean, regarding their doctrine, they were very much influenced by, as I mentioned a little bit during the presentation, by the populist Russians, and the sort of a theoretical constructions allowed them to propose policy measures, especially economic measures, which might be very much included in what you just described. On the one hand, they wanted the Liberal Party in Romania in the 1920s had a very sort of a powerful policy of supporting the Romanian industry. They wanted to basically replace this because it had affected the Romanian peasants very much through the price scissors, especially. They wanted to introduce some tariff protection, and this is why even on the international level, especially during the crisis, along with other peasantist parties, they made certain attempts so that the industrial nations will stop actually supporting their own agriculture. There were all these debates in Rome and not only. And they also, I mean, once they were in power, they, regarding the problem of debts, they started to reorganize and the whole cooperative, the entire Romanian cooperative movement by organizing, through some of the measures that you also mentioned in your presentation, by organizing an important central cooperative bank that might actually finance the cooperatives, which were lacking a lot of funds. And in this sense, yes, they were a classical peasantist party, and they were also, at least until the Great Depression, a mass party. They had, despite the fact that Romanian Serenist Party is usually described as being more institutionalized in contrast with the Croatian Peasant Party, in the 1920s I think we can describe it as a mass party, exactly because on the one hand they rely on a very complex infrastructure of cooperatives and also party institutions, and on the other hand they actually had a great mass support, especially among in Transylvania, but not only.
Thank you.
Well, the only chance when they can realize their program was in 1939 till 1941, when the Banovina Hrvatska was created. It was the first time when the Croatian Peasant Party really was on the top of the power, not only in Croatia, but also with the ministers and the vice president of the government, Vlatko Maček, in the Belgrade. But it was a very short period. The war started and everything was demolished. So before the establishment of Banovina Croatia, the Croatian Peasant Party was alone, and that's why they organized its economic, educational, and many other organizations. During that short period of autonomous position, they were doing their institutional jobs. I can say in that short period they were really effective.
Maybe just to add, agricultural reform was more or less finished in the early 20s in Croatia. And exactly those were the years where Croatian Peasant Party was really boycotted the parliament. It was Republican, called themselves Republican. So it was in open conflict with the government, so it couldn't influence anything about it. What they could and they tried to do is just with private connections, or even founding a small organization called Zemlja, or land, to help people who were moving from the very extremely poor and overpopulated area to the richer part of Croatia, to find and buy at good prices some new estates. That's all what they were actually capable to do in reality, till the Banovina Hrvatska. But in the program, you ask also, I think, about that ideological way. I think that it remained quite vague, because they really needed support of all peasantry, and most of the peasantry was extremely poor, less than 5 hectares of land. It was considered to be not sufficient for existence of a family, and they needed their support. And of course they were kind of social party who wanted to help those people, but ideological ideal was to have what they called a middle peasant, self-sustained peasant with a middle estate, and it was impossible to achieve. That's why it was that they never discussed this thoroughly. Because of that, they needed support of all kinds of peasantry. It remained unsolved. There are not many official documents, even in those writings in the newspapers or some general books on ideology of peasant party.
Thank you. Tak, je zde nějaký další dotaz, nebo ano? Yes, please.
Yes, we have learned that the Romanian Peasant Party criticized the influence of foreign capital in the 20s especially, and in the Great Depression there was more or less a lack of foreign capital, and if you are a little bit cynical you can't say that the problem was solved. And after and this is my question to you, after 1933, Germany tried to build the so-called Deutscher Großwirtschaftsraum to make an informal economic empire, and the first members should be Romania and Yugoslavia, and that's why is my question: how was the attitude of the agrarian parties in Romania and the Croatian, or another agrarian party or a peasant party in Yugoslavia to these efforts of Germany, because there were contracts in 1934 and 1935, and this is the first question. And the second, to Ivica Šute, to Suzana Leček. When I read your title, to use all opportunities, and realized that you will speak about the Croatian Peasant Party, and especially about Stjepan Radić, for example, there came a little story in my mind, and you did not mention it because you had another perspective. You came from the political system of Yugoslavia or Croatia, and then you show us where the Croatian Peasant Party was in it. But if you took the Croatian Peasant Party as a part of the international agrarianism, there was a very interesting story that Radić wanted to have support from other peasant parties, and I don't remember when it was exactly, but if he don't get this the support from the Green International, I think in 1923 or 4 he went to Moscow and to the Crest Interne, to the Red Peasant International, and you didn't tell us anything about it, and I was interested in this. What is only a little mistake, or what was it?
I mean, although it might sound a little bit awkward, but the answer to your question is pretty complex in the sense that the peasant, there was a sort of a series of constraints which imposed on the Romanian Peasantist Party sort of a new foreign policy, especially in regard to economic issues. It was, first of all, the fact that the gold standard had disappeared, which was basically like the sort of a main liberal institution. Starting with 1933, Germany was very successful in establishing bilateral agreements with the Balkan countries. I think that Bulgaria was the first and Romania the second, which were more or less I mean, it's very hard to actually criticize them because both Romania and Bulgaria were in dire need of industrial products. So that basically the position of the Romanian Peasantist Party during those years, in 1944 and 1945, when this was obvious, that bilateral agreements had replaced the liberal circulation of capital and liberal exchange and free exchange, was to propose, and this is what they did at the international commissions, but nobody actually listened, to propose a sort of an international system, a very complex international system of structuring bilateral agreements, so that there should be some sort of a coordination in the way in which these bilateral agreements between various countries are made. Germany and Austria refused, and they actually vetoed against this idea when it was proposed, I think, in 1933. And this was one of the reasons why this sort of a bilateral agreement continued throughout the period, and which put the Balkan countries sometimes in a position of inferiority. Romania more than Bulgaria because of some sort of technical issues.
Just one remark. The major economic partner of Kingdom of Yugoslavia after 1934, due to the clearing agreements, was Germany. And it was a good solution for the Yugoslav peasants, especially the Croatian peasants, to sell their products after the end of economic crisis. But it was the matter of the creation of Grosswirtschaftsraum in that period, and it was some kind of bilateral agreements with Germany of all Balkan states. Yeah, clearing agreements. Yeah.
Yes, about 1924. It's a too short period of time to mention everything, but it's very, very interesting episode. When I was talking about those few years of first boycott and the phase of Republican Party and that passivity, it's really passivity only regarding going to Parliament. But those years were full of very intense negotiations with all political parties in Yugoslavia. After those negotiations failed, Stjepan Radić went illegally abroad and trying to get support from the other countries. They call it the internationalized Croatian question. And first he went to Vienna, then to Paris, then to London. He was studied in Paris. He had some connections both in Paris and in London, but he was refused everywhere. So he couldn't do anything. Then he tried this with Prague, with the Green International, and that was especially frustrating, and it was a really hard blow for him. He liked Prague very much. He was raised here. He was a fan of Masaryk. He got married in Prague. His wife was, Maria Dvoržáková. She was related to the composer Antonín Dvořák. So it was a really hard blow, but it was a part of that pragmatic Švehlas politics we were hearing about, because Czechoslovakia was in a small entente with Yugoslavia. Radić was a strong opponent of Belgrade government. So of course that the people also in Czechoslovakia, politics was to prefer to have good connections with Yugoslavia than to have this kind of peasant solidarity. And quite desperately, Radić went even to Moscow. He was very optimistic nature, but even he, I think, wasn't delighted with Moscow too much. But anyway, when he was there, he enrolled the party to this Red Peasant International, not Workers' International. Came back to Yugoslavia and was imprisoned because of that. That his accusation was that he was communist. Of course, it was Pašić who was prime minister at the time. Pašić was very well aware that Radić was so far from communism of any kind, but the elections were coming, so it was quite convenient to imprison the leaders of Peasant Party, to ban the party, and that was the end of this internationalism of in 24. Yes.
From what I know, the Red International had contacted Radić even before his trip abroad, because they wanted to somehow gain the support of the main, and the Croatian party was one of the most important.
Uninvited there.
Yeah.
Just to make it short.
If may I add something, I wrote 2 essays on the problem of Czechoslovakia and Croatian and Slovenian and Macedonian movement in Yugoslavia in interwar period. Because this is something what simply Masaryk probably either didn't understand or didn't want to understand. For him, simply, he said on the address of the Croats, well, you should make some deal. Right side. But we must keep in mind one thing. Interwar Yugoslavia was just Greater Serbia, nothing more. And Croatian statehood is as old as Serbian statehood. So it couldn't work simply on this pretext. If Czechoslovakism was a dead ideology in Czechoslovakia, then Yugoslavism in Yugoslavia was twice as dead. And simply the second thing was strictly political one. Czechoslovakia and mainly Foreign Minister Beneš didn't want to make anything which would hamper and undermine the Versailles system and the system of Little Entente. That's why he gave no support, for instance, for the Bulgarians when they were trying somehow, to change the international treaties because they lost part of their territory to Greece and Yugoslavia. And he said, no, it cannot be. You may be right, but it makes no difference. Simply, we stand on the sense that the system must remain intact and we will not change anything. However, it worked in the 20s. In the 30s, as was said, Yugoslavia, for economic reasons, were closer and closer to Germany, which at the end, made the little Entente half dead. Stojadinovic told to, well, if there are problems with Hungary, we shall fulfill our obligations. But otherwise, do not count on us. Tak, ještě jsou tady nějaké dotazy, prosím.
As a way of understanding of political struggle, also for Croatia, also for Romania. So my question is, can you say, did anybody reflect the works, for example, of Emil Durkheim or Max Weber in Romania or Croatia at this time and for this political philosophy?
I mean, of course, in the Romanian discussions about capitalism, along with Marx and Zombart, Weber was always mentioned. But I mean, most of this, when I said that foreign capital was somehow ethicized and perceived as a moral agent, as bad, good, serious, cool, kinky, I don't know, like a human being almost. Macharu and other sort of important sociologists or economists of the party did not necessarily try to legitimize this discourse by making reference to capitalist ethics, or it was basically simply some sort of a common discourse that set a strict dividing line between Western capitalism and Eastern capitalism and perceived them somehow as opposite. On the one hand, the strange oriental games of deceit and bribery and so on, and on the other hand, the seriousness of the Western capital. And Durkheim was not very popular in Romania, except for a sort of a important sociologist, but marginal for our discussion.
Yeah, thank you for the question. As I mentioned before, Rudolf Bičanić was well educated in Paris, and he was under the great influence of the thinking of Georges Sorel, and especially with the work of Ortega and his major work about mass riot. And he thought that in Croatia must be the same process if they want to success. I mean, the peasant, they must unite themselves, and they must act like a mass. They must show that they are their number, and they were the greatest part of the Croatian society. Mio Mirković, he was one of the greatest Croatian economists in interwar period, but he was not a member of Croatian Peasant Party. He was educated in Berlin and Frankfurt am Main, and there he was under the influence of Zombart and Oppenheimer, and especially he wrote about his impressions with the work of Max Weber.